Okay, well, we are back. Hi, everybody. It's good to see you again. Sorry about the lateness of our of this next video. I had a bit of a time management issue last time. I didn't realize how detailed I wanted to be in this next piece, and time got away from me, and so things happen. But in any case, here we are back again on schedule as usual. And today, of course, we're going to be talking about a topic that is, I think, quite relevant to today, in particular to this week. We have in Canada, you've probably heard that the pastor of the Grace Life Church in Edmonton was arrested this past week or the week before um, on the charge of ignoring public health orders. And he refused to accept the bail conditions offered by the province, and thus he is still in jail, awaiting his next court date. So, whatever you believe about the rightness or wrongness of that particular church's actions in relation to the public health orders, it has magnified and brought to the fore the debate, I think, among Christians here in Canada about the proper intersection of sacred versus secular authority. I think we all agree that the proper place of the church is the governance of the church. The church has, I think, in our mind, well, I think we'll get into that when we start up. But in any case, I want you to bear that in mind, and also bear in mind that Jake and Ann Spence from our church now attend Grace Life. They are a member of that community, of that family, and I know that the events of recent days has probably hit them very hard. So please keep them in your prayers, and also that church. They are still a church. They are still our brothers and sisters, and they still need our prayers, and they still need our support, whether or not we agree with them. We must keep the family together. So don't simply write them off. You can have your opinion, but please remember that they are our brothers and sisters in Christ. So let's show as much grace as you can. So today we're going to be looking at the question of secular versus papal authority in the Middle Ages. We are a church history course. We are not going to necessarily discuss the modern age all that much in terms of this question, but it is still a very relevant question for the modern age, and it's something you might want to discuss, or perhaps you have discussed it amongst your family members. I know that in my particular family, we have certainly discussed this numerous times around the dinner table, and certainly has gotten heated at times. But nonetheless, it's a good discussion to have because we are in a time when this is very relevant. So I have titled this particular session, Who's the Boss? Who's the boss? The battle between papal and secular authority. That's a good question. Who is the boss? Well, let's try and answer that. Maybe you can help me. Perhaps, or rather, is the boss Bruce Springsteen? Or is it Angela? Ooh, that's a good question. Who was the boss on that show? If you remember that show, you millennials will not remember that show unless you're a fan of like 80s and early 90s television. But there's a show called Who's the Boss that's particularly relevant. So was it Angela? She's the one in the blonde hair there, by the way. Was it the Pope? Or is it the King? All very good questions. And we're going to attempt to find some answers here, although I doubt that there will be much in terms of answers because this question never quite got settled in the Middle Ages and is still with us today, as we know, as I've just said. So why does this matter? Why does this particular debate matter all that much? Well, the Bible never really sets up the church as a secular organization with institutional temporal power. So by that I mean the Bible, or in the Bible, the church has never been set up as an organization that is designed to exercise governance authorities. The apostles and Jesus seem to be very willing to leave the matters of civic government to the civic government. The church that was founded by Jesus and that was led by the apostles was concerned mainly with spiritual issues. Jesus specifically told the Pharisees and other groups that his kingdom is not of this world. It is not a worldly kingdom. It is not a kingdom that looks like the kingdoms that exist in this world. He emphasized the nature of this kingdom being about spiritual salvation and peace when he entered Jerusalem on a donkey and not a horse. That was an important symbol. Donkeys are a symbol of peace and humility, whereas a horse is a symbol of war. It's a warrior's symbol, at least back in the ancient times. So we see him portrayed as coming in on a donkey, a very humble animal. A horse is a very kind of proud, ostentatious, warlike animal where by riding one, you're not only showing off your wealth and power, but you're showing that you kind of mean business. Paul never advises the church in the book of Romans, for example, to take control and conquer the world. He tells people to submit to the governing authorities. This is an issue, if you're familiar with Reformed theology and Reformed debates in Reformed theology, you will know that the question of theonomy is a question that often pops up in Reformed circles. And theonomy is essentially theo meaning God, onomy is like an economy, so the economy of God. Essentially, is the mission of the church to establish godly government, or a theocracy, if you will. It's theocracy. So are the church and state to be one? Is that the ideal, or should they appropriately be separate? Like I was telling you at the beginning of our class, way back when this whole thing started, the issue of church and state starts when they connect with the legalization of Christianity, and they connect really quickly. This wasn't a question of Constantine saying, you know what, there's this group of maligned people out there, and I'm really not comfortable with them being persecuted anymore. This is a waste of my time and money, and they're not really a threat to me. I'm going to stop persecuting. I'm going to legalize their religion. No, what happened was he legalized it, and then he brought a whole bunch of them into his sphere of orbit and appointed many, many Christians to powerful positions in the government and in the army. And he actively supported it, which tied church and state together in this Gordian knot that's almost impossible to undo sometimes. And it's a very uncomfortable knot. These fibers, sometimes they fit, and sometimes they really don't fit together, but we're stuck that way. Constantine's legalization of Christianity set the church up as an institution that had eyes, ears, and feet in the halls of power, someplace it had never been, and I would argue it had never been designed to be. So you could, in some way, say that the church has become a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the puzzle in terms of its relationship with the secular government. With churchmen and leaders becoming political actors, Christians began to relate their politics to their faith. And as we saw in the Nika riots in Constantinople, people's favorite sports teams, political factions, theological positions, they all became intertwined. It became a very big morass that caused a lot of problems. And as time progresses, the church not only keeps its moral and spiritual authority, but it acquires a physical authority through land acquisition in Italy and in Europe. And this leads to the grandiose and fraudulent, by the way, claim that Constantine had granted the Pope authority to govern the West, and thus the Pope could choose the emperor and depose him. If you remember, with our debate or with our talk on the Holy Roman Empire, that was very much a thing. The Pope justified this authority on the basis of a legal document called the Donation of Constantine, but also which was fraudulent, by the way, but also on the fact that the church, being instituted by God himself, is superior, therefore, to the secular authority, and the secular authority exists to protect, promote, and carry out the needs, edicts, and will of the church and its leadership. And secular rules, and as we go through history, secular rulers in the Middle Ages will often employ churchmen in their governments. And they were likely, because they were likely to be the most well-read and well-educated people around. But they're also a member of an organization that has its tentacles, if you will, if I can use that term, all over Europe. This is a robust organization. If you want to think of the state as like a structure, imagine the church as like a steel structure, and alongside is a wooden structure, and that's sort of all the principalities and the duchies and the kingdoms and the governments of Europe. And if there's a fire, the wooden structure will burn away, but the church, that one will remain. And that's always the way it is, as principalities and dukedoms and wars change the political map of Europe over this time. The church remains in place. So it has a very important staying power, and that gives it a lot of power in government. It gives it a lot of economic power because it eventually acquires lots of land and money, and it also gives it political power because the church has a great deal of institutional knowledge. So to whom, or is it to who, does authority belong? So that's a little grammar game. You can look that up if you like. It's a little trivia question there. I don't have the answer, by the way. I suspect it's to whom, but I won't pretend that I know that. The spiritual and the secular powers in the Middle Ages are often ill-suited to each other, and they often clash. As much as churchmen and kings can get together to accomplish common goals, and as much as churchmen might subsume their duties to the will of the state in some cases, by and large, the relationship is kind of like pushing two magnets together sometimes. Medieval kings and princes will often disagree with the Pope and fight him on things, but it's important to note that this doesn't mean that they oppose the church or Christianity itself. So this is where the political position of the Pope becomes clear, is that if you're opposing him politically, doesn't mean you're opposing the organization, the church, the Christian faith. It means you're opposing him and his political agenda, I suppose you could say. It's easier for kings and princes to see and make the divide between the Pope's spiritual authority and his claims to temporal power. They stand to lose the most if his claims are recognized. The common people are not usually privy to the political decisions of the day, and thus tend to view the Pope as a more holistic authority. So whereas a king or a prince can say, well, the Pope is both spiritual leader and he's a temporal leader, and I'm really fighting him on the temporal issue, not on the spiritual issue, the people of the day see the Pope as a unified whole. They don't parse his roles, and so that can cause problems sometimes in certain kingdoms as well, particularly when the nobles are grumbling and they're looking to rebel, or looking for a reason to rebel in any case. So the battle between the secular and the sacred today is often summarized as the separation of church and state, or we put forward the notion of the separation of church and state as sort of the ideal or the gold standard in how these two organizations should interact with each other. Now, there's different concepts of this, even in the West. So in North America, this is seen as the church, and all faiths for that matter, being free from government interference and oppression. Remember, as far as America goes, in the United States, Canada, and Great Britain, the government was heavily involved in religion and and frequently interfered in it. And so, particularly for the American revolutionaries, getting the government out of religion is a big thing, because it means that the country doesn't have to be focused on religious factionalism, which can stir up all sorts of rebellions and really get people heated, because religion is one of those things that really can cause bad arguments and rebellions, more so even than politics or the economy. But it's interesting also that in places like France and Quebec, here in Canada, it's a little bit different. Separation of church and state is seen as the state being protected from the church and religious zealotry. So that's an interesting dichotomy, don't you think? Whereas, in the English parts of North America, we tend to view separation of church and state as being the protection of the church or the faith from the interference of the state. whereas in France and in French-speaking countries, it's seen as a protection of the state against the interference of the church. And if you look at France pre-French Revolution, which started in 1789, the church was heavily involved in France. It was part of France's corrupt monarchical government. And so you can certainly see why they would have that notion. And in Quebec as well, up until the Quiet Revolution of the 1960s, the Catholic Church in Quebec was really a power unto itself. Governments didn't do things unless the bishops were on board. And that flipped in the space of several years. It's a very interesting thing. Study Canadian history, guys. Look up Quebec, the Quiet Revolution, study Canadian history, and find out why Quebec is one of the most secular places in North America. It's really interesting. Study it. Okay. And for those of you who are around during this time, you should know all this. So study it again so you can tell your grandchildren. So there's two events that kind of help us to illustrate this feud between secular and sacred authorities in the Middle Ages. These aren't all of them. These aren't maybe even the best ones, but these are the most prominent ones. And so there are many of these things. I'm not going to go into all of them. I picked two because they're the most dramatic and most interesting to talk about. And one of them is the Investiture controversy, and the other is the murder of Thomas Becket. The Investiture controversy. So in 1076, Pope Gregory VII and King Henry IV, King of Germany, rather. So this is Henry IV of Germany, who later became the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, were in a dispute about who had the right to install new bishops and abbots and who had the right to give them their signs of office. So this would be their ring and their staff of office, which represents a shepherd's crook. The controversy was simmering for a very long time, but had its formal instigation, if you will, in a disputed, papal election. Disputed elections are something we are intimately familiar with, particularly this year. What a year! Not only do we get this stark instigation of what the difference or what the intersection of church and state authority is here in Canada, but we also get to deal with disputed elections in the United States and a global pandemic and all the stuff that comes with it. It's absolutely nuts. But we are aware of the messes that can be caused by disputed elections. So let's hope that they are very rare. Pope Benedict X had been elected pope in a rigged election in 1058. And there were most assuredly true allegations of bribery. So a group of cardinals who were opposed to Benedict's election, his fraudulent election, held a second conclave, which selected a guy named Nicholas II as a pope. So Nicholas, who was supported by the Norman rulers of Naples and Sicily, managed to seize the Vatican and overthrow Benedict, who is now considered an anti-pope. And he's considered in Catholic history by the church as an anti-pope as well. So that's an anti-pope is someone who opposes the pope or someone who is in the place of the legitimate pope. And there's going to be a crisis or a schism in the church during the Middle Ages where there will be a pope in Rome and a pope in a city called Avignon in France. And they're going to be in opposition together. And the various powers of Europe are going to choose loyalties to which pope they want. And eventually that gets solved by the Council of Constance, I think. Just before the Reformation? Maybe a few hundred years before the Reformation. In any case, and also the Normans, I want to point out that the Normans are in Naples and Sicily. And if you remember, the Normans are Viking Norsemen. That's where their name comes from. They are Norsemen. And they had wide-ranging territories by this time. Naples, Sicily, Normandy, England were all in their sphere. So Nicholas II, the Pope, issued a papal bull. And a bull is a decree. It's not an animal. It's from the Latin bulla, which means seal. And he issued a decree called In Nomine Domini. There's one too many E's on there. But in any case, In Nomine Domini, which set down a formalized election process for the papacy. And just as an aside, if you've ever wondered how a papal proclamation is named, they take the first three words and that's its name. Okay? So that's like if you were writing a book, and that's like, if you're writing a book and you say, Jane had a dog, the first three words are Jane had a. So that's how you would title your book if you're going in this way. But this is the convention for naming papal decrees. So it can be that there are many decrees with the same name, but it's kind of cool in any case. This is an example of a papal bull. I just wanted to show it to you. So this is this is a rather recent one. So you can see at the top there the Pope's name, Benedictus Episcopus Servus Servorum Dei. That's the Pope's title. Benedict, Bishop, Servant of the Servants of God. We've talked about that title. Interesting. They're always written in Latin. Latin is the official language of the Catholic Church. And you can see there a silver seal attached to the cord. And that is the bull. That's the bulla. That's what gives this thing its name. And I believe this is about changing the constitution for a monastery somewhere. But in any case, problem solved. We have the papal election is over. The decrees have been published. We're all done. So in Nomine Domini decreed two important items for our purposes here. First, it stated that the emperor and nobility would not have a say in the selection of the pope. And lay investiture, which is the giving of the symbols of sacred office by non-clerics. So this is like kings and emperors and nobles giving symbols of office rather than clergymen, is forbidden. And churchmen installed in such a way do not really hold their office. So churchmen must have their office, their appointment from the Pope, and they must be installed by either the Pope or bishop or an abbot or somebody of some ecclesiastical authority. Now, this is obviously not problem solved, and a council of German bishops, standing behind the authority of the authority that their king claimed, decreed this bull null and void. They got together in a council and said, look, this bull does not stand. We don't recognize it. And they made the politically astute decision to side with the emperor to maintain imperial authority. And in particular, they were supporting the claims to imperial and royal authority of the Empress Agnes, who was the regent for her son, the then child king Henry IV. Henry IV's father was Holy Roman Emperor. His mother was married to him, so therefore she is an empress. Henry IV is not the emperor at this time because he has not been crowned emperor, has not been elected emperor. So he is still the German king, although it's, like I was saying before, the Holy Roman Emperor's title can be just a title sometimes. In any case, we won't get hung up on that. So the German bishops decide to do the politically astute thing and support the ruler of their own country. In 1075, Pope Gregory VII was elected, and Henry IV became of age. He was 15 at the time. So 15, and you're ready to rule the country. How many of you would let your 15-year-olds drive your car? Never mind lead the army or conduct foreign affairs. So just, bear that in mind. Gregory had been a supporter of Pope Nicholas II's idea on church authority, and he claimed that the Pope was the sole supreme power on earth and that princes, kings, and emperors could be deposed by him. So he claimed the old papal authority. I am the Pope. I have this power that's been given to us since time immemorial. I am appointed by God. I am God's representative on earth. Therefore, I have the authority to depose any king or ruler who has it coming. This power also includes the ability to release nobles and commoners from their oaths of fealty to secular rulers. So what he's saying is not just, I'm deposing you as king. He's saying everybody who has taken an oath of loyalty to this guy doesn't have to follow it anymore. There's no sin in not following it. That's a big deal. That undermines the feudal system, which is based on fealty and various duties of one level to another. Of one level of society to another. So additionally, a church council was held in Rome at the Lateran Palace, one of the Pope's residences, that same year, which also decreed that the Pope had the authority to move churchmen from diocese to diocese as he saw fit, and could even appoint and remove them without consulting the king. So that's a big deal. Generally, the king would want a say in who's appointed to what diocese. but the Pope is saying, I have the right to do this myself because I'm the Pope. And I can appoint whoever I want, and I can move them where I want, and I can take them down wherever I want. You have no say in this. And Henry IV, as you can imagine, being the German king, did not really see it that way. So Henry IV, not the Shakespearean one, for those of you who are Shakespearean lovers, the other one, not Castile, not the French one, but we'll just read on. Henry is a very common royal name, you'll notice. And Henry IV, if you don't specify, it can get really confusing. On the right here, you'll see the empire or the kingdom that Henry ruled. He ruled Germany there and all those other parts as both king and emperor. And except for I believe the papal states down there around Rome. So Henry IV is born in 1050 to Emperor Henry III and the Empress Agnes. Henry III believed that kings, being who are anointed at their coronations, and that's still a thing. Our queen was anointed at her coronation as well. Constituted a priestly office, and he claimed to be the Vicar of Christ, which is the title the Pope claims. And then, as emperor, he was the leader, therefore, of Christendom. So the Christian polity, all of Christianity. And he had, therefore, the right to pick the Pope. The Pope didn't really agree with that. So at the age of 6, Henry III dies and leaves Henry IV as King of Germany and as a candidate to be the new emperor. And his mother, it says Anna, that should be Agnes. His mother acts as regent for a time for part of his reign. And at 15, he is old enough, considered old enough to rule in his own right. Gregory VII, again, not the calendar Gregory. I know you're all waiting for Gregory the 16th, who is the calendar Gregory, but we're not there yet. So Gregory VII is a guy by the name of Hildebrand. That's his original name. And despite what his name suggests, he is born in Tuscany in 1015. So he's older than Henry. He held high office under several popes before his election, and he's elected pope in 1073, and he instigates a number of successful reforms to the church. So he successfully insists that the clergy refer all disputes to him in Rome to judge in Rome. So if there's a dispute between two bishops or between a priest and his bishop and it's not being resolved, he wants to judge that. He does not want that going to the king. He strengthens the ban on clerical marriage. He forbade simony, which is the selling of offices, which was a very common practice in this time. And he recognized the providential provision of the state for the stability and peace of a country. But he claimed that papal and ecclesiastical supremacy over it. That is going to hurt my jaw. Ecclesiastical. That's a good crossword clue, by the way. And if you can get that in Scrabble, all the power to you. So Henry, I'm entitled to my entitlements. If you can tell me who said that here in Canada, that's a famous quote from our history. You get brownie points. When Henry IV became King of England, or King of Germany, he continued his father's policy of appointing his own bishops and abbots without reference to Rome. And as we saw, that the German church wasn't really going to argue with him. He did not approve of the Declaration of the Lateran Council in saying that only the Pope could move churchmen and appoint and remove them. He reacted in a suitably ostentatious, over-the-top, and frankly imperious manner, as emperors or emperors in waiting tend to do. He sent Gregory this following letter, which was very temperate, I suppose, for him to do. I'm going to try and read this to you. Let me get rid of my video there. Okay. Henry, king, not through usurpation, but through the holy ordination of God, to Hildebrand, at present not pope, but false monk. Such greeting as this hast thou merited through thy disturbances, inasmuch as there is no grade in the church which thou hast omitted to make a partaker not of honor, but of confusion, not of benediction, but of malediction. For to mention few and especial cases out of many, not only hast thou not feared to lay hands upon the rulers of the Holy Church, the anointed of the Lord, the archbishops, namely bishops and priests, but thou hast trodden them under foot like slaves ignorant of what their master is doing. Thou hast won favor from the common herd by crushing them. Thou hast looked upon all of them as knowing nothing, upon thy sole self, moreover, as knowing all things. So everybody knows nothing and the Pope knows everything. That's what he's saying the Pope claims. This knowledge, however, thou hast used not for edification, but for destruction, so that with reason we believe that Saint Gregory, whose name thou hast usurped for thyself, was prophesying concerning thee when he said, the pride of him who is in power increases the more, the greater the number of those subject to him, and he thinks that he himself can do more than all. And we, indeed, have endured all of this, being eager to guard the honor of the apostolic see, though thou, however, hast understood our humility to be fear, and hast not accordingly shunned to rise up against the royal power conferred upon us by God, daring to threaten and divest us of it. How dare you threaten to divest me of my power? It was given to me by God. As if we had received our kingdom from thee, as if the kingdom and the empire were in thine and not in God's hand. And this, although our Lord Jesus Christ did call us to the kingdom, did not, however, call thee to the priesthood. God called me to my kingdom. He didn't call you to the priesthood. For thou hast ascended by the following steps. By wiles, namely, which the profession of monk abhors, thou hast achieved money, by money favor, by the sword, the throne of peace. And from the throne of peace thou hast disturbed peace, inasmuch as thou hast armed subjects against those in authority over them, inasmuch as thou, who wert not called, hast taught that our bishops called of God are to be despised, inasmuch as thou hast usurped for laymen and the ministry over their priests, allowing them to depose or condemn those whom they themselves had received as teachers from the hand of God through the laying on of hands of the bishops. On me also who, although unworthy to be among the anointed, have nevertheless been anointed to the kingdom, thou hast laid thy hand. Me, who as the tradition of the Holy Fathers teaches, declaring that I am not to be deposed for any crime unless, which God forbid, I should have strayed from the faith, am subject to the judgment of God alone. I am subject to the judgment of God alone. You can't judge me. Nobody can judge me. For the wisdom of the Holy Fathers committed even Julian the Apostate not to themselves, but to God alone to be judged and to be deposed. For himself, the true Pope Peter also exclaims, fear God, honor the king. But thou who does not fear God, dost dishonor in me, his appointed one. Wherefore St. Paul, when he has not spared an angel of heaven, if he shall not have preached otherwise, has not accepted thee also, who dost teach otherwise upon the earth. For he says, if anyone, either I or an angel from heaven, should preach a gospel other than that which has been preached to you, he shall be damned. Thou, therefore, damned by this curse and by the judgment of all our bishops and by our own, descend and relinquish the apostolic chair which thou hast usurped. Let another ascend the throne of St. Peter, who shall not practice violence under the cloak of religion, but shall teach the sound doctrine of St. Peter. I, Henry, king by the grace of God, do say unto thee, together with all our bishops, descend, descend, to be damned throughout the ages. You can imagine what the Pope's response to that was. Essentially, Henry says, you have no authority over me. My bishops, you have trodden us underfoot. You have paid no attention to us. You have treated our bishops with contempt. You have treated me with contempt. And I am anointed as well. And not only that, I am the king. And I can only be judged by God. But you are the Pope, and you got your throne through evil means, through money, through the sword. You stole the throne of peace through the sword and through violence. You get off the throne. You are deposed, and you are to be damned throughout the ages. The damned throughout the ages part is thought to be a later addition. I don't know it, but it's a fantastic line, I have to say. So in this letter, Henry IV advances with vigor the old imperial claims that the emperor has the imperial power to appoint and remove popes, that the imperial authority is just as sacred as the pope, if not more sacred, and that the imperial authority is appointed by God himself, not by popes. And he also accuses the pope of being a usurper of the office, of being corrupted by money. He emphasizes his point, and he emphasizes this point by appointing his own chaplain, a guy named Tedald, as the Bishop of Milan, in opposition to the bishop appointed by the pope, who is a man called Atto. So the cards are dealt, the dice are cast, and Henry waits for the pope to make his move. And the move that he makes is to blow the foundation from Henry IV's power as king. He excommunicates him, he deposes him, and he releases all of Henry's nobles from their oaths of allegiance to him. This is a very good move because Henry has a problem. He's been at war with his nobility for some time. They have been attempting to wrest more power to themselves and to weaken the king's authority. And the nobles take the papal offer up and they run with it. So Henry is beaten in this case. The nobles that Henry is fighting essentially begin to destabilize his throne. And he needs to come to a resolution, and pretty quickly if he's to keep his kingdom. So the Pope's power play had worked, but Henry had a plan. He knew canon law well. This is the law of the church. It's called canon law. And he knew that the Pope had a major weakness. The Pope is a priest. And so therefore he traveled to where the Pope was staying, which is at the castle of Canossa in northern Italy. And at first, the Pope refused to see him. So Henry stood outside the castle gates wearing a hair shirt, which is a sign of penitence, and he stood barefoot in the snow and fasted. He's presenting himself as a penitent Christian seeking absolution to a priest, not a king seeking a diplomatic solution to the Pope. And now for the Pope, this is an untenable position. After 3 days, he's admitted to the castle where he kneels before the Pope and asks for forgiveness. And the Pope, as a priest, cannot deny absolution to a penitent seeking forgiveness. He can't do that. He has to give him absolution. And so the Pope lifts his excommunication and gives him communion, essentially inviting him back into the church as a full Christian. Now, the Pope is not convinced that Henry is a penitent, not by any stretch of the imagination, but in this case, he has no choice. If he denies forgiveness to a penitent, it will harm his position as a priest mightily. So this really doesn't settle the battle between Gregory VII and Henry IV. Henry would be excommunicated several more times by Gregory, but he was successful in securing his throne against internal political threats for the time being. His successor will not be as powerful as he is, but for the time being, he's okay. At one point, Henry sets up his own anti-pope, Clement III, in response to Gregory's excommunications of him. So he says, look, you keep excommunicating me, I'm just going to have my own pope. So he has a new pope elected, a guy named Clement III. And Henry attacks Rome in 1081, and he captures the Vatican in 1084. So he puts the city under siege. And he installs his pope in St. Peter's Basilica, and the new pope, Clement III, crowns him emperor there. Now, Gregory VII is still around, but he had fled to the Norman-controlled kingdom of Naples, and he dies there the next year in 1085. The anti-Henry cardinals then elect Victor III to be the pope, and Victor would be succeeded by Urban II, who of course initiated the First Crusade. And it was Urban II, who reunited the church under one papal authority. So the German kingdom that Henry ruled over would become very fractious and would weaken considerably by his death in 1106. And the controversy between Pope and Emperor continued under Henry's son, and it was only settled by an agreement called the Concordat of Worms. That city ends up being a big player in history for some reason, but that's interesting. But anyway, in 1122, the Pope and the Emperor signed the Concordat of Worms, and the Concordat was a compromise. It eliminated lay investiture, so kings and priests, or kings and emperors and princes couldn't invest bishops and abbots with their signs of office, but they would have a significant say in who was appointed. So this is a point where, that's the investiture controversy. So if you've ever heard of the investiture controversy, that's what it is. And it's basically who has the right to the fealty and loyalty of bishops and abbots. Bishops and abbots are very powerful people, and their power can affect the stability of the state, and their wealth is very is enough that it would cause the kingdom problems if they decided not to employ it for the benefit of the kingdom. And so you see here Henry attempting to keep the mantle of the emperor as leader of Christendom intact. And we know that in the Eastern Empire, this was not an issue. The Eastern Empire practiced caesaral papism. Emperor is pope. In the West, that's not the case. And there's a messy intersection where, yes, Henry is anointed, but he's not a priest. He's a secular ruler. And the Pope is not technically, he's not supposed to be a secular ruler. He's a priest. What right does he have to interfere in the internal political affairs of a country? But in any case, that's the investiture controversy. The next one we're going to move on to is the murder in the cathedral. And this is between Thomas Becket and Henry II. So no country could have been said to have wholly harmonious relations between the clergy and the monarchy, and England is no different. In 1066, William, the Duke of Normandy, invades England, and he overthrows the Anglo-Saxon King Harold to become King William I, and he's known to history as William the Conqueror. William was French, and he was a Norman. And as I've said before, the Normans are a group descended from Viking Norsemen who had regularly raided the coast of France in the Dark Ages, and Normandy was given to them by the King of France in an attempt to pacify them, essentially make them settle down and stop raiding the coast. The Normans became a major player in medieval European politics, eventually controlling Normandy, England, southern Italy, and Sicily. William had a very close relationship with the head of the English Church, the Archbishop, and he appoints the Archbishop of Canterbury, a Norman named Lanfranc. Now, Lanfranc and William are very, very close, and that allowed William to replace the native Anglo-Saxon bishops and abbots with his own Norman men and supporters. So essentially, the English are thrown out and the French are thrown in. So the hierarchy of England becomes very French. And in fact, French will remain the main language of the English court until Henry VIII, I believe. French will be a very important language. And in any case, he also replaced Anglo-Saxon buildings with Norman buildings. So the Normans really made their mark on the English landscape. They built the Tower of London, by the way. So if you see the Tower of London, that's Norman architecture. This permitted the royal government of England a level of influence in church affairs that would have probably been contested elsewhere. And to give you an idea of what Henry's family tree looks like, this is the royal family in the 12th century. So starting off at the top, we have William the Conqueror, who married a woman named Matilda of Flanders, and they had a few children. So they had William II, who becomes the King of England, Robert II, who becomes the Duke of Normandy, and then Richard, a bunch of daughters. Then you have the Duchess of Brittany, his daughter Constance, and then his daughter Adela marries Stephen, Count of Blois, and they have a son named Stephen of Blois. They're clever with names. In the thank goodness for family names, I have to say. If I was Amos of Grunthal, I know there'd be at least two of me, and I don't know what would happen if there were only names like Jake of Grunthal. Jeez Louise, that would be terrible. In any case, so Stephen of Blois, and you can see Stephen of Blois is listed as King of England. So just as a primer here, when William dies, his son William II becomes king. William II doesn't have any kids. He dies childless. He is succeeded by Henry I, who is the third son of William the Conqueror, who is his brother. William marries Matilda of Scotland, and Henry has one legitimate one legitimate offspring, a daughter named Matilda. But the right of women to inherit the English throne is not an established thing at this time. And so it is argued that Stephen of Blois, who is the grandson of William I, is a better candidate for kingship than Matilda, who is a woman. Even though she is the granddaughter of the king and daughter of the king, Stephen is the nearest male heir. And there's actually a civil war called the Anarchy, which is fought between Matilda and Stephen essentially wins out on that one. But eventually, Matilda wins the day when her son, by her second husband, Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, becomes king after Stephen is killed, or dies. I think he died. Henry II, who is the main player in our story, marries a woman named Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, for those of you who are interested in looking up the role of women in the Middle Ages, you're not going to find too terribly much. Most of the history is read on men, but Eleanor of Aquitaine is probably the one that you want to study. If anybody is a feminist, it's Eleanor. By right, she inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine, which was a huge, rich territory from her father. And she also went on crusade with her husband, her first husband, who was the King of France. And Eleanor has several children with Henry. You can see them all there. Richard the Lionheart and King John being among them. Excuse me. But yeah, so very, very influential family. By the way, from Matilda onwards, the family name is the House of Anjou. From Matilda upwards, it's the Norman dynasty. So that's a primer of the family of Henry II. And by the way, Richard the Lionheart wasn't as nice as you think he is. So as I said, William I is succeeded by his son William II. And then when William II had no children, he was succeeded by his son Henry. And Henry I, who is the grandfather of Henry II, realized that his ability to govern England and his Duchy of Normandy relied on the compliance of the church hierarchy, being the organization that kind of bridged both polities. Henry I, like the Emperor Henry II, believed that the clergy owed allegiance and loyalty to the king, and the king had the right to give them their symbols of office. Henry and the Archbishop of Canterbury, a guy named Anselm, operated a long-running feud where the king would exile the archbishop and confiscate his estates, and the archbishop would then excommunicate the king. And eventually they came to an agreement and even could work together when needed. Compromise in politics, go figure. So when a dispute arose between the Archbishop of York and the Archbishop of Canterbury over who was superior, the king wanted the matter adjudicated under his authority in England and not referred to the Pope in Rome. The king was also able to exercise a lot of influence in the succession of bishops and abbots, carefully inserting his own supporters and the children of his friends in these positions. And this also allowed him to form a more cohesive set of advisors from the church instead of relying on the archbishop alone. So he was able to circumvent the archbishop's authority by having his friends and supporters appointed to church offices and then consulting them like a council. Henry II came to the throne after a period of civil war following the death of Henry I. That's what we were talking about, the anarchy. Henry II is the grandson of Henry I through his mother Matilda. Matilda was first married to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. And when he died, her father remarried her to Geoffrey, Count of Anjou. When Henry was born, he inherited his mother's claim to the English throne and his father's lands and title as Count of Anjou. And Henry II later marries Eleanor of Aquitaine, the daughter of William X, Duke of Aquitaine. And this expanded his French territories dramatically. In addition to Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine, he acquired or inherited Poitou, Maine, Touraine, Saintonge, La Marche, Périgord, Limousin, Nantes, and Quercy. And he also obtained suzerainty over Brittany, so lordship over Brittany. And that's what his kingdom looks like. I'm just going to transition that out of there. There we go. So that's what his kingdom looks like. The part in the red is controlled by Henry. And he controls England and those territories, including Brittany. That's a lot of France. That's a third to close to a half of modern France. Now, France back then, if you look at the map, you see the part in blue. That is called the royal domain. That is the part of French territory that the King of France controls directly. All the other territories he controls as the overlord, and the lords of those territories owe him fealty and loyalty as vassals, but he doesn't control them directly. But it's the same thing here. So Henry's possessions, known as the Angevin Empire, he is a vassal of the French king for his French territories. So he has to do fealty to the French king as the Duke of Normandy, as the Count of Anjou, as the Duke of Aquitaine, not as the King of England. So as you can imagine, English kings typically didn't like doing this very much, paying homage to the King of France, that is, and they avoided it as much as possible. And in the Middle Ages, that was grounds for war. And needless to say, there was war between the French king and Henry, but Henry was a very powerful monarch. Interestingly enough, as a side note, the Duke of Aquitaine, or the Duchy of Normandy still exists today. Normandy is part of France today, but the Duchy of Normandy still exists. This old Norman principality still exists, and it exists on two tiny islands right over here. Ooh. Those are called the Channel Islands. They're also known as Jersey and Guernsey. You may have heard those names before. And in those islands, the Queen is still toasted as the Queen our Duke, la Reine notre Duc. They never use the female form of the word if the reigning monarch is a woman. It's the Queen our Duke. She is the Duke of Normandy and Jersey and Guernsey. That's a 1,000-year-old title that's still kicking around. By the way, if you're a fan of Canadian history, Isaac Brock was from the Channel Islands. If you remember Isaac Brock, the war hero from the War of 1812, the great leader of the British military here in North America, the victor of the Queenstown Heights, he was from the Channel Islands. Henry and the Church. So Henry II claimed the traditional rights of the English king over the Church, and the right to appoint bishops and abbots, and the right to mediate disputes between clergymen, plus the right to try members of the clergy in royal courts instead of ecclesiastical courts when they were accused of crimes. He also claimed the right to receive revenue from abbeys and church properties, as his grandfather, Henry I, had done. Henry II's first Archbishop of Canterbury was a guy named Theobald of Bec. Theobald and Henry generally got along pretty well and found room for compromise when they clashed. However, while they never came to blows, Theobald and Henry disagreed over the English practice of trying clergy in secular courts. This is going to be a big problem for Henry. So when Theobald died, Henry saw an opportunity to put forward a new Archbishop of Canterbury who would be more compliant with him, much like Lanfranc had been with William the Conqueror. And the man that Henry chooses was a close friend who also happened to be his Lord Chancellor, a guy named Thomas Becket. So the office of Lord Chancellor in the Middle Ages is an office that essentially served as the monarch's chief minister and head of the judiciary. So it's an important office. Becket is born in London around 1119 to parents of a relatively moderate social status. His father is a minor landowner who made enough money off of rents to not have to work. His mother was a Frenchwoman from Caen in Normandy, the same city that actually Theobald of Bec was from. Becket was often invited to the country estates of his father's wealthy friends, where he learned the various pursuits of the nobility, for example, falconry and hunting. And actually, falconry looks really cool I can definitely see why they did that. But if you're afraid of birds, probably not the best thing. But anyway, look it up. It's kind of cool. Becket received a decent education, and from the age of 10, he started getting a decent education. And we know that later on in his youth, he spent about a year in Paris, not studying, however, he was gallivanting, as young men in Paris tended to do. Becket's father, however, began to suffer financially, and Becket was forced to return home to work as a clerk to help support the family. Becket was snatched up by the household of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Theobald of Beck. Oh my goodness, I've been talking for almost an hour here. Okay, anyway, we're going to keep going. He enters Theobald's household as a clerk. Theobald gave Thomas several important offices and oversight duties over his estates, and he proved to be quite good at it. And Theobald rewarded him by giving him a variety of church benefices. So these are essentially offices that paid well but had no work. They were basically titular offices. You got paid a lot of money, but you didn't have to do anything. Theobald would then recommend Thomas to the king to fill the post of Lord Chancellor in 1155. And Becket proved just as able with the king's finances and estates, as he rigorously enforced the king's traditional rights of revenue from the nobles, the church, the monasteries, and the bishoprics. He was good at what he did. He got the king lots of money. And he and the king became close friends, and they partied and drank together and caroused together a lot. Becket was even entrusted with raising the king's son, also named Henry, in his own household for a while. So you remember, we go back to the family tree. We see down here, this Henry the young king, as he is called. Becket and Henry partied together a lot. They caroused together a lot. Becket lived a very luxurious and ostentatious lifestyle as Lord Chancellor, didn't mind using his office to enrich himself. And Henry thought, this is perfect. And in 1162, when Theobald dies, he nominates and appoints Thomas to the bishop to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury. Boy, what a great move. Becket, however, is not a bishop. He's not even a priest. But when you're the king, you can get things done pretty quickly. So the king has him ordained as a priest on June the 2nd. On June the 3rd, he is consecrated a bishop and then archbishop. When you're the king, you get things done. Now, if Henry had thought that appointing his drinking buddy as Archbishop of Canterbury would allow him more hand to meddle and influence church affairs, he was very sorely mistaken. Becket resigns from the office of Lord Chancellor. He's not required to. He can hold this office, but he resigns from the office of the Lord Chancellor. And far from being a lover of luxury and ostentation like he had been as Lord Chancellor, as the Archbishop, he became one of the most pious and staunchest defenders of the rights and independence of the Church of England that had ever been seen. He goes a complete 180. Now, Henry is far from impressed with the new ascetic lifestyle adopted by Becket. Becket very much adopts the lifestyle of a monk. And problems began soon after his appointment as the king and archbishop argued over who had the right to try clergy, royal courts or ecclesiastical courts. Henry believed that permitting the clergy to be tried by ecclesiastical courts undermined law and order in England and his responsibility as king to provide justice equally to his subjects. At the time, the men did not necessarily have to be priests, abbots, monks, or bishops to be considered clergy. They could, in fact, take something that is known as minor orders, which allowed them to carry out the work of like deacons in the church, but they were not, required to be celibate or not marry or to take vows of poverty or anything like that. But they would be considered clergy. So this claim to exemption from the royal court is known as the benefit of the clergy. And this was a big deal for the king because 20% of England fit into this category. So can you imagine if 20% of Canadians could claim the right not to be tried by Canadian courts. If there was another more lenient court system out there that we could go to instead, there'd be a bit of a problem, don't you think? So Henry argued that Theobald of Bec had defended the English practice of trying clergy in secular courts to the Pope, which was true, but the Pope did not necessarily accept this argument from Theobald. And Theobald might have been doing it at the behest of Henry I as well. So Becket, or Henry II as well. So Becket also sought to restore the land of the archbishopric, which had kind of been given away to supporters of the king, and other dioceses who had lost land to secular landowners. And while a royal writ was issued that allowed him to do this, he did it in a very high-handed way, and the landowners complained to the king about his actions towards them. He also appointed officials to churches where local tenants and landowners claimed the right to do so. So he starts to make a nuisance of himself to people, particularly people who feel that their traditional rights are being violated. Becket and Henry argued over the right of excommunication of the king's vassals. The king argued that no one who held land from him as a vassal could be excommunicated without his agreement. In 1163, Henry calls the bishops of England to meet in the city of Winchester, which is the ancient capital of Anglo-Saxon England, where he proceeded to complain to them about the governance of the church's lack of compliance with English customs in relation to church-state relations, and by implication, his attempt to undermine Becket. The bishops agreed to following English customs only so long as they agreed with church law. Otherwise, they stood behind Becket. Now, the king is not impressed with this, and he dismisses the bishops. He then retrieves his son from Becket's household and removed all the honors that he had bestowed on Becket. And this basically telegraphs to everyone that Becket was out of royal favor. And to socialize and associate with Becket was to put yourself in enmity with the king. You're on my side or on his side. Becket and the king began a series of political maneuvers to secure allies. The king managed to move many bishops over to his point of view, although this doesn't necessarily mean they became enemies of Becket. He just kind of got their grudging support. Becket, however, sought to get Louis VII of France and the Emperor Frederick I, also known as Frederick Barbarossa, which means Redbeard, on his side. Barbarossa is a noted military leader, and he was on the First Crusade, I think. No, Third Crusade. Or is it the second? We'll talk about that when we get to the Crusades. So Becket is seeking support from other European leaders. He also begins to make plans if he needs to seek asylum on the continent. So he essentially starts putting together an escape plan. The Pope, Alexander III, refused to get involved to adjudicate between Henry and Becket. Despite being a close friend of Becket, Alexander is going to walk a tightrope on this one, and he walks it pretty well, as you'll see. Henry II summons a council of bishops and barons to his palace at Clarendon in 1164, and there he demands that the bishops, including Becket, agree to uphold without amendment or reservation the practices and customs of the English Church that had been in place during Henry I's reign. Becket resisted this, but Henry and his supporters wore him down, and he verbally agreed to go along with them. The king had a document known as the Constitutions of Clarendon drawn up to codify these customs, and he told Becket to sign it. But Becket was unwilling to do so, although he was willing to give verbal assent to do it, or to it. The constitutions made it clear that the clergy charged with crimes would first appear before a royal court, which would then determine if he really was a member of the clergy. And if it was true, he would then be transferred to an ecclesiastical court for trial. Ecclesiastical courts offered very lenient sentences, so they weren't allowed to order executions or basically any sentence that would shed blood. So they were allowed to defrock a priest or degrade him, which means he loses all of his rights. They could fine him, they could flog him, or they could excommunicate him. And then, so the constitutions then demanded that after the ecclesiastical court was finished with the person, the church could no longer protect him, and thus the person would then be sent to a royal court where he would receive a secular punishment. And Henry would also order royal officers to be present at ecclesiastical trials as well. Essentially, the church traditionally argued that clergy accused of a crime should be charged and tried in church courts. Oh my goodness, that's a tongue twister. Charged and tried in church courts, and further sent on to royal courts for what amounted in their mind to. So essentially, what the church said was, if we do this way, or this is Becket's point, if we do it this way, you're essentially punishing a guy twice. And that's the argument that Becket made to the king. And he said, look, there's no point in punishing him twice for the same crime. If he's convicted in our court, he loses all of his rights. And if he is therefore accused of another crime, he is tried by a royal court. So there's no point in doing any of this. It's kind of it doesn't hold water in my view, because if you think about it, a clergyman accused of murder would be subject to only those punishments there. He wouldn't be put in jail or executed necessarily. So Becket, I think he's kind of got a weak point here. Becket refuses to sign the constitutions, as we've seen, despite taking a verbal oath to uphold them. And while Henry decided, therefore, that he was going to put Becket himself on trial and charge him with malfeasance, essentially claiming that Becket had committed crimes and abused his power while serving as chancellor. Becket dithered in response to the summons from the royal court, and that led to him being convicted of ignoring a summons, and they confiscated all of his property, non-landed property, that is. The king then charged him again with inappropriate spending while chancellor, and that he was not fulfilling the verbal oath he had taken to support the constitutions of Clarendon. Becket refused to stand trial on the charges, and he was found guilty in absentia, and then he fled to France. So in France, the king asked the Pope to order Becket to go back to England, but the Pope refused. He also refused to order the king to back off Becket, so you can see he's playing a tightrope here. Becket sought refuge at the Cistercian monastery at Pontigny under the protection of Louis VII, which was basically outside of Henry's immediate reach. Although Henry has territories in France, this is not one of them. And there's a picture. The top part of the map is where Pontigny is, and the picture below is the Abbey Church there. So that would have been the church that Becket would have seen. Most of it was torn down during the French Revolution, but the church remained. The king ratchets up the pressure by exiling Becket's family and his servants, as well as their land and the property of any of Becket's staff who went with him. Becket kept up a large letter-writing campaign to bishops and nobles in England and continued to urge the king to settle the dispute with him. And eventually the Pope told Becket to stop because it was provoking the king's ire. The church at this time in England was being run by the Bishop of London, Gilbert Folliot, who Henry had appointed to continue running the church in Becket's absence. Despite the Pope's orders to Becket, Becket began to threaten the king with spiritual punishments if he didn't settle with him. And Henry ignored this threat. While Henry ignored the threat, Alexander III raised the stakes in the dispute by appointing Becket papal legate in England. Essentially, he's the Pope's personal representative in England, empowered with papal power and with great authority. So the Pope is playing on both sides here. He's walking a tightrope. Becket then uses his authority to excommunicate several of Henry's advisors and confidants, including the Bishop of Salisbury. Henry and his advisors sent appeals to the Pope, despite Becket's claim that, as legate, his decisions were final. There is no indication that the Pope ever intended that the legate's decisions would be final. So this is a bit of an empty claim. In the meantime, while this appeal was being processed, Henry told the Cistercian order, which was sheltering Becket in their monastery, that if they continued to shelter him, he would kick them out of England, or kick the order out of England. And the Cistercians then went to Becket and very calmly asked him to consider the health and future of their order and the harm that it would do to them if they were kicked out of England. And Becket agreed to go to the city of Sens, still under the protection of Louis VII. The Pope attempted a mediation between the king and Becket by sending legates from Rome to act as judges in the affair. Henry agreed to this judging, or this mediation, and he even agreed to amend the constitutions of Clarendon to be a little bit more in line with what Becket had wanted. But Becket refuses this mediation, and the legates don't have any mandate from the Pope to force him to agree. And so they go back to Rome, and their effort falls apart. Becket later excommunicates the Bishop of London himself and several other nobles, despite not warning them. With an excommunication, you're supposed to give a warning to give people a time to repent and come back in. Becket doesn't do that. He just excommunicates them. And this adds to his reputation for high-handed judgments. So the Bishop of London successfully appealed his excommunication, and in 1170, Henry decided that it was time to secure his son's right to succession by crowning him junior king, or co-king, if you will. And he would be known to history as Henry the Young King. Crowning kings of England in England is the sole right of the Archbishop of Canterbury. This is an ancient right. Only the Archbishop of Canterbury can crown a monarch of England. But the coronation of Henry the Young King had been conducted by the Archbishop of York in Becket's absence. Becket was livid, and the Pope permitted him to put England under the interdict. The interdict is a punishment whereby the Church refuses to perform nearly all rites and sacraments. No Mass is held, no burials are held, no funerals are conducted, last rites are not given, no communion is held, and no confessions are heard. Essentially, the churches are shut down under the interdict. So this is a very big rebuke. This is a very big punishment. And the interdict would be placed on England not only in Henry II's time, but also in King John's time, his son. This threat basically brought Henry back to the bargaining table, and he permitted Becket to come back to England. However, Becket found out that several of Henry's supporters, including some churchmen, were traveling to France to meet the king. And Becket, ever the tactful person, excommunicated them, and he even excommunicated the Archbishop of York for performing the coronation in violation of Becket's rights. So in November 1170, Henry is informed of these latest excommunications, and in a fit of rage, he yells one of two things. We're not quite sure, but it's either one of these two things. Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest? Or, what miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and brought up in my household, who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born cleric? Now, 4 of Henry's knights are around when he says this, and they take this as a royal command and to deal with Becket. And so they set sail to England and to essentially deal with him, because the king is in France at this time. So the 4 knights are Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard Le Breton. Now, if you're thinking, man, there's a lot of French names in here. There's a lot of French names in here for a story about an English king. Remember, the English kings at this time are more French than English. There's an interesting thing where people always criticize the current monarchs of England as being more German than English because their ancestry is Hanoverian, and they have lots of German blood in their system. And the question is always, well, how long does one have to be in England to be English? And but here, the English king is more French than English. It's kind of the similar thing to how people say the monarchs of England are more German than English. I don't really know if that's true, but in any case, that's why there's so many. The William the Conqueror made French the thing du jour, and because of all the French territories that the king held, Frenchmen held high positions in the English court. On December 29th, 1170, the knights arrived at Canterbury Cathedral during during Vespers, and the monks saw them coming and barred the doors. But Becket said the doors should be opened, as it was improper to deny people the right to enter a church to pray. Excuse me. The 4 knights entered the church and demanded to know where Becket, the traitor, was. And Becket said that he is not any such thing. He's not a traitor. And they told him that he had to go to Winchester to answer for his crimes to the king. But Becket refused and continued performing the service. The knights then attempted to drag him out of the cathedral, but Becket held onto the pillars and began to pray. The knights then struck him with their swords, severing the top of his head off. This part, not this part, this part. And he was struck in the head 3 times and died, the chroniclers tell us, with his brains scattered on the cathedral floor. Now, the murder of the archbishop in his cathedral turned Becket into a martyr, and a significant cult of veneration developed around him. He was canonized as a saint by Alexander III, his friend, who walked the tightrope between Henry and him. The 4 knights were not punished by the king, but were excommunicated by the pope, and they had to go in hiding before he offered them penance. They were required, as part of their penance, to go to the Holy Land and serve 14 years as knights protecting pilgrims in the Holy Land. Henry was also made to do penance as the instigator of all this, and this involved him walking a gauntlet of monks who whipped him as he went by. And he had to do this naked, by the way. He also swore to go on crusade, but he never did. Becket's tomb would be a major source of pilgrimage in the Middle Ages up to the Reformation. And his tomb was turned into a gold and jewel-encrusted shrine, and it was very, very popular. But it was destroyed by Henry VIII during the English Reformation. Henry II would soon face rebellion by his sons, which include Richard the Lionheart and King John. And his wife, Eleanor, supported the sons. It's a very dysfunctional family, I would say. Henry would come to an agreement with the church after Becket's death not to push customs that the church objected to. So essentially, he comes to the compromise that he should have done with Becket after Becket dies. Henry dies in 1189 at the age of 56, and he's buried in France at Fontevraud Abbey. And he was at war with his sons until the very end. One of the questions is, why does the Pope walk such a tightrope with Henry and Becket? I mean, doesn't it make sense that he would want to support Becket over Henry? But it's an interesting contrast. Alexander essentially needed the support and help of Henry to counterbalance the power of Frederick Barbarossa. Remember, Henry is a powerful, wealthy king in Europe, and the Pope needs him as a supporter to balance out the power of Frederick I, the Holy Roman Emperor. He could not afford to make Henry an enemy. The Pope also recognized that giving in to Henry's demands would weaken the structure and hierarchy of the church in England, a situation that could happen elsewhere as well. And so Becket's stubbornness proved a useful bulwark against the encroachments of the king. So you could say that Alexander played both sides. He needed Henry politically, and he needed Alexander politically, and he needed Thomas politically. Thomas to push back against the king, and the king to push back against Frederick. He's not going to antagonize the king. He's going to use Becket to do that. So he uses Becket and the king to balance each other out and allow him to get the benefits of both sides. So he's actually quite a clever guy, this Alexander III. So some discussion for you in your family groups or even in your own head. Who was right? Was it Becket or was the king? Did they both have a case to make about their respective roles? The investiture controversy and the Becket affair show us how messy the church-state intersection can be. And they both had the rights of the church versus the rights of the state at the heart of it. So here's some questions for you. What right did the state have in appointing and investing church officials? When the state has an interest in the operation of the church, shouldn't they have a say too? Or what's the intersection of those two? We can even ask that question today with church services being cut back or canceled. What is the proper function of church and state? Who protects who? Who benefits who? Are these functions distinct? Is there a space for both rights to intersect peacefully? Is it better for church and state to be distinct and separate, or should they have a closer relationship? I think nowadays, when we look at the medieval church had an idea of leadership, of church leadership, called magisterium. That is, the Pope and the bishops and the priests as rulers, not as shepherds. In the modern times, or at least with the Reformation sought to change that. They recognized the role of elders and bishops and preachers as shepherds of their sheep, not political leaders. And the shepherd role, not the magisterial role, became emphasized by the Protestant reformers. And in the Middle Ages, for 1,000 years, from the time of Constantine until the Reformation, for that roughly 1,000-year time frame. The magisterium viewpoint is the one that takes root and is pushed. And I think that that's where a lot of these problems come. If the Pope and the church had seen themselves as shepherds looking after and protecting their flock, feeding their flock, meeting their needs, I think that the disputes between the kings and the church would have been a lot less, and there would have been a lot less blood spilled over it. But that's just my opinion. Anyway, that ends our session for today. We went a little bit longer, but I hope you enjoyed it. Any questions or comments, you can feel free to email me. And we will see you hopefully next week with some new material. It might be the Crusades. I might start on the Crusades next week. I might do Innocent III next week. Not quite sure, haven't decided yet. But in any case, we'll see you all next week. And I hope you have a really good week. I said week too much. I'm sorry, that's bad writing. Have a good period of time until we see each other again.